what our plan is to really make sure we understand what artificial intelligence is and get ourselves in a good foundational place so that we can explore what kind of legal considerations will follow out of the development and the use of artificial intelligence. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start by defining what artificial intelligence is. Your reading starts with this great definition that comes from Kurzweil. AI is an attempt to build machines that, quote, perform functions that require intelligence when performed by people, end quote. Very solid, very well-known definition. These are the kinds of things. Intelligence in this context is the kind of thing we're talking about, machines that can recognize patterns, that can process language and make suggestions or recommendations. And when we think about humans, one of the first signs of intelligence is being able to recognize things, especially faces. If somebody's been in a coma or they've been very ill, one of the things that we're looking for is that they recognize us. That's a sign of intelligent life. One of the first things that we do with babies is we play peekaboo, and we recognize this sort of growth in intelligence at the point where the baby recognizes that you haven't disappeared just because your face is behind the hands, that they're recognizing who you are. Processing language, understanding, translating, formulating answers to questions, all of this is an innately human intelligence task. And ultimately making suggestions, recommending things, answering questions. All of this is very human. And now we're seeing artificial intelligence being used for things like recommending books or music, for planning logistics, or even deciding who goes to prison and for how long. So we'll talk about a lot of these kind of applications as we move through. And of course, I want to break it down. But before I break it down, I really want to stop for a moment and ask ourselves, why do we need to define AI in the first place? What is it about this crazy woman with the colourful clothes and her desire to make us understand all of these definitions? Is this just a legal thing? Well, let's think about it. I mean, it's a really good question for those of you who are frustrated by this. There are lots of functional or abstract concepts, I should say, abstract concepts that we have a functional understanding of, but we couldn't necessarily define immediately, like happiness or irony. There's an irony as how hard it is to describe what irony is. Time. Actually explaining what time is, it's a very complicated concept, but we know it when we see it. In fact, Justice Potter Stewart of the US Supreme Court famously said once in relation to hardcore porn, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Surely artificial intelligence, that's enough for us, right? The answer to that question requires us to think about what a system of law is. So again, I'm answering a question with a question, not something ChatGPT would do, let me tell you. So one of the reasons we need to think about what the definition is because ultimately we're going to be talking about what legal consideration is. So it's not sufficient to follow Justice Stewart and just say we'll recognise it when we see it. For a legal system to function effectively, the people who are subject to that legal system need to be able to understand the ambit and the application of the rules. So on the slide, you can see 4 principles that come from a legal theorist, an American legal theorist called Lon L. Fuller. And they include the 4 that are on the screen. A requirement that laws should be promulgated so that citizens know the standards to which they're being held, and that laws should be understandable. In order to pass the tests that Fuller has put together, systems need to use specific and workable definitions when describing the conduct or the phenomena that are subject to the regulation. He's got a rather charming quote, I think. He says, we need to share the anguish of the weary legislative draftsman who at 2 a.m. says to themselves, I know this has got to be right, And if it isn't, people might be hauled into court for things we don't mean to cover at all. But for how long must I go on rewriting it? It's probably how you feel a little bit about essays from time to time. Essentially, he puts together a really good moral or ethical argument that people can't choose to comply with a rule that they don't understand. If a law is impossible to know about in advance, then its role in guiding the actions that people take will be at the very least diminished, probably destroyed. Unknown laws are really a tool of the powerful. They basically, the kinds of laws of those of you who are great readers might recognize from Kafka. There's a book that Kafka wrote called The Trial, where the protagonist is accused, condemned, and ultimately executed for a crime which is never actually explained to him. So it's important, if we're going to regulate AI, that we actually agree what AI is. Just as we're going to regulate what conduct is suitable for people, we need to actually understand what a person is, which one would think has been relatively lacking in controversy. But as many of you will realise, those of you particularly who looked at the first sort of Intro to Law Module 0 in our course, that Aboriginal people in Australia were not under the law that was imposed on white settlement, considered to be people for a very, very long time. So that is not new. And women were not accorded all of the benefits of people for a very long time as well. So sometimes we can have concepts that we think we know, but unless we're very clear about what they are, we're going to get ourselves trapped when it comes to talking about them. Let's start with the easy thing, artificial. The word artificial is relatively uncontroversial. It means something synthetic, something that doesn't occur in nature. I tend to talk about artificial intelligence and organic intelligence, but I could call it natural intelligence or something else. But I guess there is an argument that intelligence is just intelligence and the source of that intelligence may not be relevant, but we'll explore that in a little bit more depth as we proceed. So let's dig into what the idea of intelligence is. This, unfortunately, is controversial. There are a range of different abilities and cognitions that are roughly bundled together in the idea of intelligence. It tends to be something that is studied by psychologists, and there have been a range of definitions that have been adopted. The reasons I have on the slide here come actually from an op-ed statement that was made in the Wall Street Journal back in 1994. I believe that around 50-odd psychologists actually signed it, but it was kind of problematic in a range of reasons. Sorry, you would not, whether you're looking at the slide or not, be able to read that image, but it had basically a list of very different things. Some of them, I think even read just on 20 years later, seem very out of date and don't necessarily accord with our understanding of humanity in the same way. But some of them I think are really interesting and helpful to us as we think about what intelligent is. So they include things like intelligence is a very general mental capability. It reflects a broader and deeper capability for comprehending our surroundings. So intelligence involves knowing where we are. Intelligence, so defined, can be measured, and intelligence tests measure it well. They are among the most accurate, in technical terms, reliable and valid of all psychological tests and assessments. Are they? Are they really? I think there's a lot of work that's been done more recently around the extent to which bias and experience creep into those assessments of intelligence. So, intelligence tests. What else do we have in here? Sorry, I actually think the other slide here is probably the earlier slide with the blue boxes. For those of you looking at home, it's probably more useful. And I've picked out there the things that I think really stand out. ultimately, this idea of a very general mental capability that involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, to think in the abstract, to comprehend ideas, complex ideas in particular, to learn from our experience, from our memory, so we can repeat things, but we can also synthesize. Those things form part of our intelligence. It's a catching on, so to speak. So think about it. A lot of the discussion in this week, and a lot of what I'm really asking you to think about, is how is artificial intelligence different from organic intelligence? And when we move along to Turing in particular, and we think about the Turing test, at what point, and I'll explain that in a subsequent video, but at what point do we really need to differentiate between intelligence and the source of intelligence? But when it is that we're thinking about regulating or the legal considerations that apply, actually being able to determine whether a decision has been made by man or machine, and I mean man here in the very generic sense of person, human person, we need to think about what that means for regulation. And remembering that we've already spoken about this idea of a company, which is really a device. A company is a legal construct that provides for making sure that decisions that are made by our company, no human, but the humans who represent a company, for allocating responsibility for those decisions. So it's not something that we haven't done before. We have allocated responsibility for decision making to something that is not human. This is definitely something that we will be considering as we move through. So we can also think about human intelligence in broader ways than just what comes from our brains. Many of you will have seen the picture that I have on the screen describing a range of different types of intelligences in primary schools. This is an infographic, an infographic that's been shown in primary schools since my kids were little, and my kids are older than many of you. It's basically trying to isolate that there are ways of being human, intelligent life that also encompass emotion, encompass our physicality, encompass the way that we engage with the world, the way we respond to nature or respond to other people. So what do these things have in common? Ultimately, we can't do them without a functioning brain. And so when we're talking about organic intelligence, we know that all of these kinds of intelligences, they're inoperable if our brains don't work, if our brain is not connected to our body or is not functioning. And so the thinking is the thing that the brain does is absolutely fundamental to understanding what intelligence is and what artificial intelligence is. And so in an artificial world, the thinking is effectively the processing that is done by computer algorithms. So computer algorithms, they can be really simple things. For example, we could be talking about sorting algorithms, for example, things that sort things from A to B or from highest to lowest. But they could also be really complex, like speech recognition or facial recognition. Every artificial intelligence system, AI system, just like any other computer system, will incorporate algorithms. But an algorithm is a broader concept than just AI. Algorithms used in AI embody practical reasoning as well as the capacity to learn from data. And it's that learning that is really important. We're going to come back to what learning is as a separate video as well. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about algorithms. Let me get an algorithm slide up for you. I want to remind you that there's a couple of videos on the Canvas, they're going to do a much better job with many fewer words vastly fewer words than I would possibly come up with. And I really significantly want to remind you that it's important that you go through the Canvas videos as well if you haven't already. So there's a really great little explainer on what an algorithm is, which literally works through how you could create an algorithm yourself. And at risk of a spoiler alert, that's a really important one for you to make sure that you've been through for the quiz this week. But the other one on the same page talks about Muhammad ibn, I'm not going to be able to say his name properly, but basically the father of algorithms. Now, the history of the algorithm is really interesting, and I think absolutely worth the 5 minutes or so for the BBC explainer video. That is absolutely worth looking at. The algorithm was invented effectively by a complete polymath, from whose name both we have algorithm and algebra, who literally came up with nothing. Yeah, literally, until he thought about it, we didn't have zero. And the ability to think about nothing, to have zero, has changed mathematics and ended up with most of the world using the Arabic numbering system, or a version of it that we use today, because of the lack of usefulness ultimately of those old Roman numerals, which only lawyers seem to really hold on to. We use them in legislation quite a lot. So let me talk a little bit more quickly about this algorithm idea so that we can bring together our definition of what AI is. In order for AI to work, it involves algorithms that might have different kind of epistemic or practical reasoning based or use of the data that's available to the system. And it will involve different ways of learning from that data. So that word epistemic, it's really an important word. It means relating to knowledge itself. And if you hear the word I'm going to throw it away. I'm having a bad pronunciation day. Epistemological, that means relating to the study or the theory of various aspects of knowledge. Our systems themselves, what makes them unique is they can develop, or they enhance themselves by developing new ways of learning, new heuristics. So they modify their internal data, and they can even generate their own algorithms. So a heuristic, that word you'll come across a lot in the reading, it really means some kind of mental shortcut, the kind that's commonly used to simplify problems or to avoid cognitive overload. Heuristics are a part of the way that the human brain has evolved, the way that our brains are wired, and they allow us to quickly reach reasonable conclusions or solutions to complex problems. But they can also incorporate biases that we're not aware of, and they can result in developing stereotypes that can limit our understanding of what's going on around us, because we don't see what we don't expect to see. That's exactly what a heuristic is doing. It's helping us not absolutely overwhelm ourselves. So in any system that can learn, the most important components aren't the algorithms that directly perform the task that the system has been tasked with. Rather, they're the learning algorithms that modify those first algorithms so that they can continue to improve the way that they perform their functions. Over the last few decades, AI has become more and more successful. So the reading will refer to the so-called AI winters, but I think, if nothing else, the relatively recent explosion of ChatGPT and the ways that we're talking about ChatGPT has shown us that AI has entered into our lives through a range of different things. So information search, voice recognition, image and face recognition, medical diagnostics, automated translations, virtual assistants, calendar managers, document classification, document analysis, question answering, games, high-speed online trading, industrial and home robotics, automated vehicles, smart fridges, smartphones, All of these things are just evidence that AI is encroaching more and more into our lives and providing more and more opportunities for us to think about what artificial intelligence is and how we need to see it regulated.